When hearing that a game is roguelike, players today seem to have one of two reactions. They either embrace this style of gameplay with open arms, or they run for the hills. Personally, I'm open to roguelike games if they're well made and fun to play. Elsie is the latest release to attempt a procedurally generated roguelike loop while offering gameplay reminiscent of the Mega Man series, borrowing more mechanically from X as opposed to the original series. But is Elsie a hyperkinetic blast, or does it have a case of the runs? Let's find out in our full review. Real quick, don't let the echo chambers of gaming feed you word vomit. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and head over to patreon.com/idreamofindiegames to gain Discord access, early ad-free shows, and support independent content like this. Your new indie gaming community is waiting for you. Elsie, as I mentioned, is a 2D action platformer with procedurally generated worlds and a roguelike structure. As our story begins, we are introduced to Dr. Gray, who has built an army of mechanical androids to defend the world from dangers. These androids are known as the Guardians. While things are going well enough with the Guardians defending the world, disaster strikes one day as the Guardians go missing. A robot invasion takes place, and with Dr. Gray possessing what appears to be a very special core, she creates one last android to battle off the evil forces. You guessed it, that android is Elsie. And now you're on a quest to reclaim the Guardians and save the day. It's a story as old as time, and Elsie doesn't do all that much interesting with it. I wasn't particularly attached to any of the characters, the writing is rather sparse and nothing special, and overall it's just another forgettable plot that is clearly inspired by Mega Man. Elsie does attempt to bring some life to its script through voice performances, but they aren't constant, and while some performances were decent, almost reminding me of a WayForward game at times, they aren't consistent enough for them to add much value to the game. In fact, many of the characters quickly repeat themselves, and that gets a bit irritating. I can't tell you how many times I heard Elsie talk about putting gear in her rear.
I really need a drink.
Awesome! What do we have here? In the rear, spin the gear.
It's forgivable though, as most players aren't going to be here for the story and will be interested in how the game actually plays. The classic Mega Man series is celebrated for its well-designed, predefined levels, amongst other things, with the X series being a bit of an evolution of that structure. In the X games, you can cling to walls, the levels are more fleshed out, and it carries a mature vibe. Elsie borrows more from the X series while adapting a similar structure to more recent indies such as 20XX and its follow-up 30XX. As the game begins, players are dropped into a hub world. This is where the majority of your upgrading will be done. At the center of the hub is a tower leading to 5 different areas, with the goal being to free a Guardian from each one. Initially, the hub won't offer much, but as you progress in the game, you'll unlock new townsfolk that will sell you upgrades ranging from foods that give bonus stats to collectibles and new perks and weapons. The hub itself is a bit drab. There are a few robots and characters to interact with, but they have nothing of importance to say. This made the hub world feel more like an elaborate upgrade screen and not all that interesting. Jumping into the action, players will first blast their way through the Skyport, an area that they will see multiple times throughout gameplay. This is where we are introduced to the core mechanics of Elsie, though the game doesn't teach you everything on your first run, instead revealing new gameplay elements on subsequent runs. I found this to be a bit of an odd choice, as some of the skills that are eventually taught to you would have come in handy sooner. For example, I didn't realize I could thrust downward onto floating icons and be propelled upward until my third or maybe even fourth run. Elsie is equipped with the equivalent of a Mega Blaster. She can jump, wall jump, dash, and even has some secondary skills and attacks. Mechanically, the game feels very good, by far its greatest strength. I love the platforming, and the shooting is responsive, with a variety of different weapons to be earned. Not every weapon is equal, however, as some were rather slow and required me to repeatedly mash the action button instead of being able to hold it down like other weapons. Using such weapons can feel more like a chore. Regardless, variety is the spice of life, and when it comes to weaponry, Elsie has plenty of it. Each world will be procedurally generated upon entering, with the idea being, like just about every other roguelike, to keep things feeling fresh. Unfortunately, I feel like this worked as a detriment to the game in this case. Elsie feels so good to control that I would have loved mastering predefined levels rife with secrets and smart enemy AI. Instead, I felt like the random levels were a bit boring, they lacked intricate design, and served as a slow prodding march towards an area's end boss. Elsie does attempt to spice up its foes a bit with a parry system that is sometimes required to lower their shields, but it was my least favorite aspect of the gameplay. You have to time your button press perfectly, hold that button down, and then release it at the right moment. This feels a bit forced for variety's sake, and the timing wasn't great on the default settings. Worse yet, the game didn't do a great job explaining how it works at all. Thankfully, the timing can be adjusted to make the parry system a bit more tolerable, but I never found it particularly fun. As you blast your way through areas, you'll collect various currencies, level up, and come across upgrades to assist you on your run. Players will sometimes need to make choices as to purchasing or selecting between a specific skill, which does make the game a bit more customizable. The more runs you complete, the more upgrades and weapons will become available both in town and during your runs. It's a pretty standard roguelike gameplay loop that you've likely encountered countless times at this point if you're a fan of indie games. Throughout levels, you'll also encounter optional bonus areas where you have to gun down a set amount of targets. Unfortunately, these areas aren't very fun and offer no variety. It would have been nice to have different challenges as opposed to tracking down targets in boring areas over and over again. This, amongst other examples, remain Elsie's biggest downfall throughout. For as good as it feels, it's just not always that fun to play. The boring enemy attack patterns, bonus rooms, forced arena battles, and monotonous levels that you run through over and over again are a stark contrast to the excellent jumping and shooting mechanics. I like a good roguelike, but this one gets old particularly fast. While Elsie is fairly challenging at times and players should expect to die often, things feel unbalanced when it comes to the bosses. Many of the game's bosses toss ridiculous patterns your way, which often felt just about impossible to dodge. It's an odd decision, with the rest of the experience feeling at least a bit more manageable. Needless to say, I didn't think these fights were very fun to figure out. Granted, this is a roguelike after all, and hardcore fans of the genre live for these types of challenges alongside the slow grind of getting slightly better each run, and you will get a bit of that here. Despite the game being procedurally generated, there are just a handful of unique area backdrops, so while you may see a new platform, spike, or enemy here or there, prepare yourself to go through the same plant, ice, or fire areas that end up not always feeling as different as they should. You'll need to visit these areas many times trying to find the Guardians, which seem to appear at random. This leads me to the really sad and unfortunate part of this review. I think I broke Elsie entirely and I was unable to complete the game. After finding 4 out of 5 Guardians, the final one would simply not appear for me no matter how many times I went through the game. Regardless of the combination of levels I entered, it just did not matter. The ice world appeared to be the culprit, with the Guardian not appearing, and when reaching out to the publisher for help, they didn't have a clear answer as to what was happening. The issue seemed to be related to bad, random luck. Hopefully, this is a problem that will be patched out by the time you play the game, but it is worth mentioning. This was a bummer as I had invested well over 7 hours into the game, and it felt unsatisfying to not be able to complete it, or test out a second unlockable character that is supposed to be more based on close-range combat. Even if the issue is fixed, Elsie does a poor job of giving players objectives. Visually, Elsie has a nice pixel art look to it, reminding me a bit of a GBA game at times. The characters are cute, though lack a variety of portrait art. The levels themselves look quite nice, and the enemy and boss designs are pretty impressive. Animations were also quite good, with a soundtrack that delivers high-energy synthy compositions. So all told, Elsie is a nice-looking product that sounds good too. The previously mentioned voice performances are just fine, though often sparse and repetitive. As far as performance was concerned, the game ran just fine, but of course, had that game-halting bug, which is a pretty big deal. Elsie ended up being a fairly frustrating experience for me. On one hand, I think the game feels great mechanically, it has nice visuals, and a rockin' synth soundtrack. But on the other hand, its roguelike structure holds it back a bit in this case. The enemies are pretty boring, the boss is overpowered, and the loop is rather repetitive. There are some cool options here for different weapons and upgrades, but in the end, it never quite felt as fun to play as I would have liked. It does have some solid accessibility options like invincibility if you need it, but overall, I feel pretty mixed on this one, and it was a tough one to score. But here at I Dream of Indie Games, we believe games are so much more than a number, which is why we review games with our Genie Lamp system. Bronze represents a good game with quite a few issues, Silver a great game that has just a few small problems holding it back, and the Golden Genie Lamp of approval for those essential indie releases that belong in your collection. We also have the Rusty Lamp for mediocre titles that have just a faint glimmer of hope, and the Indie Krampus for games that simply can't be redeemed. With that said, I'm going to have to award Elsie the Rusty Lamp. There are some really great aspects to this game, but it just has too many issues for me to really call it a good game. I would maybe suggest a sale price, or at least waiting it out for a few weeks to see if it ultimately becomes a halfway decent roguelike, but as it stands, This one's pretty mediocre.
I really need a drink.